Throughout the remarkable history of the Beatles, Paul McCartney was widely regarded as the group's most optimistic and diplomatic member. While John Lennon embodied rebellion, George Harrison pursued spiritual depth, and Ringo Starr remained the band's emotional anchor. McCartney often served as its stabilizing force, enthusiastically engaging with the press, championing new projects, and speaking passionately about the band's future. To the public, Paul appeared endlessly positive. Even as internal tensions mounted during the late 1960s, he continued to project unity and excitement. Yet behind the scenes, a more complicated reality was unfolding. As the Beatles evolved artistically, so did their differences, and not every creative direction sat comfortably with McCartney. But inside the studio walls of Abbey Road, a very different story was unfolding. As the band matured and pushed the boundaries of popular music, creative differences intensified. Innovation no longer felt collaborative, it became ideological. And among the hundreds of songs released under the Beatles' name, there was one track McCartney found almost impossible to listen to, a recording that symbolized the growing distance between the men who once wrote songs shoulder to shoulder. By the middle of the 1960s, the Beatles were no longer just the world's biggest pop group. They had become the most influential cultural force in modern music. Each album reshaped expectations. Each release challenged the idea of what rock music could be. In the early days, everything came naturally. Lennon and McCartney completed each other's sentences, melodies, and lyrics. Producer George Martin guided their ambition with classical discipline. The band operated as a single creative unit. As confidence grew, individuality followed. Paul McCartney gravitated towards structure and craftsmanship. He believed deeply in melody, clarity, and emotional accessibility. Even at their most experimental, he wanted Beatles songs to feel human and immediate. Influenced by avant-garde art, political radicalism, psychedelic exploration, and his deepening relationship with Yoko Ono, Lennon became fascinated with breaking musical form entirely. Music no longer needed to comfort listeners, it needed to challenge them, even disturb them. The first visible cracks appeared during the recording of Revolver in 1966. While working on Lennon's psychedelic composition She Said, an argument erupted so intensely that McCartney walked out of the studio altogether. At the time, it seemed insignificant. In hindsight, it was a warning. As sessions continued through Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band and Magical Mystery Tour, McCartney increasingly assumed a leadership role. He organized rehearsals, refined arrangements, and pushed the group towards perfection. The results were historic, but not everyone appreciated the pressure. By 1968, tension was no longer hidden. The recording of the Beatles, better known as the White Album, captured both the height of the band's artistic freedom and the collapse of its unity. Instead of collaboration, the sessions were marked by separation. Band members worked in different rooms, sometimes on entirely different days. Arguments became routine. Patience vanished. Rather than functioning as a band, the Beatles began operating as four solo artists sharing a name. The album itself reflected that fragmentation. It moved wildly from gentle acoustic ballads to heavy blues, satire, folk confessionals, and raw noise. It was brilliant and deeply unstable. That instability reached its most extreme moment in a track unlike anything the group had ever released, Revolution 9. It contained no melody, no chorus, and no conventional rhythm. Stretching beyond 8 minutes, it unfolded as a disturbing sound collage of tape loops, orchestral fragments, distorted voices, reversed recordings, and radio broadcasts. Repeating endlessly through the chaos was the haunting phrase, "Number 9." The piece was largely constructed by John Lennon and Yoko Ono, inspired by experimental composers such as Karlheinz Stockhausen. McCartney's involvement was minimal. When Paul finally heard the completed recording, his reaction was immediate and restrained only by diplomacy. Recording engineer Geoff Emerick later recalled, I could see from the dark cloud that came over Paul's face that he was totally underwhelmed with Revolution 9. John looked at Paul expectantly, but Paul's only comment was, "not bad," which I knew was a diplomatic way of saying that he didn't like it. To Paul, Revolution 9 represented everything he feared the Beatles were becoming: detached, inaccessible, and self-indulgent. Ironically, Paul had never opposed experimentation itself. Some of the band's most revolutionary recordings, Tomorrow Never Knows, A Day in the Life, and Strawberry Fields Forever, were built on radical studio techniques. The difference was that those songs still offered melody, emotion, and narrative. Revolution 9 offered none. Placing such an abstract sound piece alongside traditional songwriting felt to Paul emotionally jarring. It disrupted the flow of the album and risked alienating the audience that had grown alongside the band. Modern listening habits seemed to support his discomfort. More than 5 decades later, streaming data consistently shows Revolution 9 as the most skipped song in the entire Beatles catalog, a statistic that remains unchanged across platforms. For Lennon, however, the track symbolized liberation. It was proof that the Beatles no longer needed to obey commercial expectation or musical tradition. McCartney believed in music as connection, songs meant to uplift, to heal, to stay with listeners long after the needle lifted from the vinyl. Lennon believed in truth without boundaries, even when that truth was uncomfortable. Neither vision was wrong. Together, they created the greatest songwriting partnership popular music has ever known. But by 1968, those philosophies could no longer coexist. When the White Album was released, the Beatles were already drifting apart. Within 2 years, the band would officially dissolve. Today, Revolution 9 remains one of the most debated recordings in rock history. Some consider it visionary, others refuse to listen past the first minute. It is studied in universities, praised by experimental musicians, and argued over endlessly by fans. Paul McCartney has never publicly condemned the track, remaining polite and measured in interviews. Yet his lifelong dedication to melody, harmony, and emotional warmth reveals everything about how he truly felt. In the end, the song Paul McCartney couldn't listen to was not merely a track he disliked. It was the sound of the Beatles no longer moving in the same direction. It was the moment when the world's greatest band quietly began to fall apart.